I pledge allegiance to my refrigerator warranty and to the refrigerator for which it stands, one cooling unit, under electric power, indivisible from the side-by-side freezer, with cold drinks and frozen TV dinners for all.
Welcome to This Week in Common Sense, starring Paul Jacob. This is the weekend podcast that recaps the big stories of the week, especially as they appear on thisiscommonsense.org, which is where Paul has been writing commentary since 1999. So, this will come out on July 4th. Paul, what is the big common sense take on Independence Day?
The whole idea of Independence Day really, to me, dovetails with this commentary, which I actually, we kind of punched it up a little bit for today, or for yesterday, but I'd written back in 2011, because so many people love the Pledge of Allegiance, think everybody should have to say it, or should certainly want to say it all the time. I'm sure they think it's awfully silly to pledge allegiance to your refrigerator or your refrigerator warranty. But I see the Pledge of Allegiance as the same sort of silly. Pledging allegiance to a republic that we created, or to the flag that represents that republic, seems to me to be not just silly, but off. Off because, the whole idea of allegiance dates back to feudal times and being a serf, and it's the sort of thing that the American Revolution was the most effective and world, shattering action against that. The Declaration of Independence, for any failing you can herald and shout about for this country, and there's been a zillion of them, and they continue to this day. And in fact, part of the whole goal of this podcast and all the agitation that people like me and people who agree with me or disagree with me do is because we want to keep making it better, because we have to, because we're not there. And frankly, I think we all recognize we'll never be completely there. But the Declaration of Independence and the idea both that all men are created equal, which is attached to the idea that all men and women, have inalienable rights. It's such a stark break from the old world and kings, and frankly, that battle between human beings have rights and they should be in control of their own government, which leads us to democratic processes and leads us to republican systems like constitutions that protect those rights. That's what July 4th is all about, because the Declaration of Independence, Independence Day, is every individual in America, in the world, in the universe, able to say, I am my own person, I have rights, I'm not beholden, I don't have to pledge allegiance to anybody. Now, when the framers of the Declaration, when the Continental Congress representatives voted for the Lee Resolution a couple days earlier, and then it was announced on the 4th, they voted on the 2nd. Of course, John Adams always thought the 2nd is going to be the holiday. He was wrong. He was wrong about a few things. But with this declaration, it's just a huge break from what's happened. And of course, this declaration needs to be made again. The last commentary we will talk about today will be about Hong Kong. And see my shirt, Free Hong Kong? Happens to be the shirt, we'll get to this in more detail, but happens to be the shirt that the first person arrested under the national security law was wearing. Little tidbit there. But what are they trying to do but declare the same thing? That they get to have democracy, that we get to choose our leaders, that we get to be in control of government. So you know, Independence Day is just my favorite holiday, the most wonderful message. But you would think then a lot of people who are patriotic then like the Pledge of Allegiance. And I don't like it. And I don't like it both because of the history, but more importantly, and I'll mention the history here in a second, but more importantly, because it gets us away from treating our system of government in the right way. We are not about how we owe certain allegiance to the state. We are about writing laws that dictate very clearly what states, what powers the state has, what rights we have and freedoms. And we ought to look at that more as a warranty, meaning here's what it says right here, and by golly, we're going to enforce it, than as some kind of vague concept, a bunch of flowery words that really kind of end up at the same place as most societies, which is the government's in charge, and you better do what you're told. And maybe you get to vote for certain things, maybe you don't. Maybe you have a certain level of freedom, maybe you don't. But you're not the creator of the government. You are not the government. And of course, when you are the creator of the government, when you are the government, when you're the sovereign, well, then it's awfully silly to pledge allegiance to yourselves. Let's read the contract. Let's read what I'll call the freedom warranty, and let's enforce it. Let's make our government adhere to the contract. And it's no lack of patriotism. It's no lack of emotion and love for the country, because I love this country. I love what it is attempting to be. I love the people who live here. There's a few exceptions, but I love you ultimately. It will just shape up. But there's no lack of any of that. But there is and ought to be a stone cold, sober look at what government is supposed to be. And we want that warranty enforced. That's what the Constitution is. And how often in these days do people treat the Constitution as something like that? I know they've got all kinds of theories about how to interpret it. I wanted to interpret it in black and white as it's written. And so anyway, that's critical. And then, of course, the more you know about the history of the Pledge of Allegiance, the less you like it. For instance, the Pledge of Allegiance was written by a socialist, Francis Bellamy, in 1892. And, his whole concept of the state is a lot different than the concept that the framers of the Constitution and the folks meeting in Philadelphia and meeting to ratify a break from Great Britain had of government. But he also had something which just shows that truth is much stranger, oftentimes, than fiction. Francis Bellamy also had something called the Bellamy Salute. And apparently this was part of the flag code for a long time. But the Bellamy Salute was supposed to be some, salute you give the flag. And it turns out it was the same salute that Mussolini and the Italian fascists adopted. And it's the same salute that the Nazis adopted and used when they said Heil Hitler. So kind of a little ugly story there, or connection. And of course, interestingly enough, not surprising, in World War II in 1942, after we had entered the war, the flag code was changed so that they suggested, let's put our hand on our heart, and not give the the Bellamy Salute. So history, very interesting history behind the Pledge of Allegiance.
Very good. And with your freedom warranty, I think we have a title for the podcast. Did you want to go through the rest of the week day by day?
I think we can go in order from there, and it's interesting that I mentioned freedom warranty, but it just goes to show how you try to think of all the right ways to say things, but nowhere in that op-ed, which or column, which I originally did in 2011, and then we punched it up this week to just make it a little bit better. You can always make it better. But I never thought to say freedom warranty, which is exactly what a constitution is. So next time we punch it up, we'll have to get that in there.
People are talking a lot about the nation's capital and the Constitution a bit, too.
Yes.
With Monday's column, which was called The State of X and Y.
I think we got more more comments on that commentary than any I can remember in recent times. And it's interesting because when we were working on it, you told me you're going to get a lot of comments on this and some pushback, and which I did. You were right. And that's not even the first time. But part of what I wanted to get out there was that I think the 700,000 people living in Washington, D.C. deserve representation and deserve more representation than they're getting. For instance, they're a territory. They do have a representative or a delegate in Congress. Of course, the delegate rarely can vote on anything, so it's not exactly the sort of representation you'd want, but people should realize it's not zero representation either. But it's not enough to me. And then, of course, the whole rub comes in because giving this city, one city, which is 1/18 the size of the smallest state, Rhode Island, in the entire country, that seems like giving them 2 senators seems like a little bit much. And one of the things that, I suggested probably the best thing is to give them, Maryland ceded some of the land to create the District of Columbia as the seat of the federal government. And I think there's been long-standing concerns about it being, having a federal area that also is on par with a state, or having the federal government within a certain state. Just, you don't have to have huge problems, but there could be certain issues of jurisdiction and so on that I think people wanted to avoid. And that makes some sense to me, too. But I think you can, and this is something that actually, Tim, you had a comment on the page because you wrote a good piece on your blog. We weren't in agreement, but we're partly in agreement, I think. It wasn't as if we were in total disagreement either. But it was one of the things that you suggested, this land could be split between Virginia and Maryland. There's all kinds of things that could happen. But one of the things that I think some people took me to task on, and I think not fairly, is it seemed very political. What I was suggesting is the alternative to just giving the land back to Maryland and the people so that they could be represented, and presumably Maryland would get the equivalent of something like another congressional district because the population would warrant that. But as someone else pointed out in the comments, the representation is limited at 435. So if Maryland did pick up another congressional district, someplace in the country somebody would lose a congressional district. So you can just see that it starts to get a little bit trickier than you think. Another issue that came up was the 23rd Amendment, which when someone brought it up, I realized, oh yes. But when we were doing the commentary, I didn't give it a single thought. Now, some people have the mind that the 23rd Amendment, what it does basically is it says that the District of Columbia for presidential elections gets at least 3 votes. It gets at least as many votes for House seats as the smallest population state, and it gets the 2 votes for senators. So when it comes to presidential elections, because of the 23rd Amendment, Washington, D.C. is treated as a state. And so some people said, well, to make D.C. a state, you'd have to amend the Constitution. And who knows what different attorneys might say. If you read the amendment, I don't think that's true. States would want to do something not to give whatever's left of the district 3 electoral votes, I think. And so there would be a move to amend the Constitution. But you could make Washington, D.C. a state without amending the Constitution. You just you'd have a real problem with how the Electoral College is set up that would bother any reasonable person until you did fix it with that constitutional amendment. But and of course, your idea, I think, could make sense to split it. But however you do it, to me, the bottom line, and then we kind of talk about some of the comments, and Tim, I'd love you to kind of give your perspective on this too. But I think any way you do it, having 700,000 people in a geographic place where they don't have real representation, equal representation, is a problem, and you want to avoid it. You don't want to give them extra super duper, more than equal representation, but you want to be, I think you want to get them something. And interestingly enough to me, Democrats could easily, I think, get an agreement to put those folks into Maryland or Virginia or both and get representation, or to make some deal, as I suggested, you could solve another problem, which is the 21 counties in Northern California that want to form the state of Jefferson. And their objection is that they're in a state that is dominated by urban areas of millions and millions of people, and yet their rural area that has no way to have any significant voting power, and so that they frankly get left out of the political conversation constantly, and so they want their own state. And which jumps back to, a lot of people look at the idea that I would say, hey, why not give Jefferson a state and give those people the representation they want and make D.C. a state? I'm not sure that's the best approach. I kind of like putting D.C. back and dealing with these issues in a different way. But I think the idea that you would have to make a political deal to add states and new senators is, to me, not terribly offensive, just because I don't think there's any way now, in the past, in the future, that you're ever going to get these sorts of very politically impactful things done without taking politics into account. And I think in some ways, a lot of the value of our founders and the Constitution and the system of government they set up, even though 200 years plus we can find a lot of problems that we wish maybe had been done slightly differently. But one of the things they did is to recognize political power, to recognize ambition, to recognize the world as it is, and try to create mechanisms that take that into account, that use that use branches that want to, take power to hold each other in check. It hasn't always worked out great, but in other words, they gave a tremendous amount of thought to that. And I think we shouldn't be too surprised that there's going to be some politics involved in adding states or senators because of the impact they'll have politically.
Well, that certainly makes sense. I mean, there is going to be politics involved. I guess my real interest in this is that if we're going to start redivvying up sections of the country, then maybe we should have a policy about that, and that we should start it in a more broad way. I think I mentioned in my piece that I think the New York City needs to be moved off of the state of New York, and Cook County in Illinois needs to be moved out of Illinois. It's really doing a great deal of damage to Illinois. There are people leaving Illinois just simply because they can't take the politics that are basically driven by Chicago. And you've mentioned separation movements in elsewhere. My favorite is the one in my state, which is they want to make Liberty State, which is a terrible title, by the way. I never want a state called Liberty. That's just almost evil. But
somehow bound to fall short.
It is. And anyway, and then there's there are people in Eastern Oregon. I mean, that was an Eastern Washington thing. This thing, I want to call it Adams. If we have Washington, I think we need Adams. But I think there actually needs to be more, even in my state. I think that the King County region and probably the counties directly north of it need to branch off and form a new state, so that there would be 3 states where once there was one. But there's even more interesting is the proposal in Eastern Oregon, where many of the people there, or at least some enough to start making a petition, want to break off the rural Eastern Oregon counties and join with Idaho. And that would be quite parallel to the idea of moving much of Washington, D.C. to Maryland or Maryland and Virginia. And so maybe what we need to do is have a real big political move to do all these things at once. I don't know if it's possible. It sounds like a lot of work.
Well, and we get to this too, but I think it is a ton of work. And to me, after you got through with all that work, you would still have a system that is just fundamentally deficient in representation. And we'll talk in a minute about more representatives being better and how to deal with that problem. But it is the sort of thing that I believe in self-determination. I think people ought to be able to change the way they're situated if they think there's a better way. If the folks in suburban Washington State or rural Washington State want their own place, or the state of Jefferson in Northern California, there's some argument to be made from urban and rural that there'd be a lot of changes there. And of course, some of them might be problematic because the urban areas are going to be much wealthier than the rural areas. But all of that, I think, can be dealt with, as you say, if there are some fundamental rules. And I think one of those rules is you want everyone to be represented. But I also think that part of the difficulty that people don't always recognize is that we talk a lot about democracy. We don't talk as much about republicanism. And maybe I have this somehow wrong, but I view the structure of our government in lots of ways to be not democratic, but republican. Term limits, for instance, is a Republican type idea that you limit power. Now, it's also been passed democratically, as anything that's going to take effect as law in this country would have some democratic antecedent. Is that right? Yeah. And so, that's to me the state structure. I have a lot of liberal friends who see that, well, we ought to be totally democratic, and the fact that Wyoming has 2 senators and California has 2 senators is not one man, one vote equal and should be changed. And one, from just a philosophic standpoint, I don't think it's such a terrible thing to have a country split into smaller units and to give those units some autonomy and some power, because then you allow people to move to different places that could be different, and they can choose, and people can vote with their feet. And as de Tocqueville talked about, the states can be laboratories of democracy. So I don't have a problem with that concept, and I recognize that it may be deficient in some democratic ways, but in Republican ways, I think is very, very helpful. But the other aspect of that people don't seem to understand is that's not changeable within the United States of America. And I didn't know this for years and years. Growing up, I never learned it in school. But there is one change to our Constitution that is forbidden by the Constitution, and that is to remove the equal suffrage, I think is the way they say it, equal representation, maybe, of each state in the U.S. Senate, so that the state of Rhode Island is equal to the state of California in the United States Senate. And there's a reason they wrote that in. We can agree or disagree. But when you think about changing that, there's only one way to change it, and that is to dissolve the United States of America. Now, we could reform, and maybe it might take a couple hours of discussion, but all 50 states could reform. You like that? I don't get you to laugh very often, but I like it. But it's the kind of thing where you would also have to allow states to opt out. You might all of a sudden have a country in New England, and you might have another country west of the Mississippi, and the southern states might form a country, and who knows? But it's and if people want to go down that path, I can understand. Some people may want to. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. But if we do, you have to do it legally, and that means that any state could opt out of the union, and you are in effect dissolving the union. That's not true with any other amendment that you would make to the Constitution, but that particular amendment is forbidden in the Constitution.
It reminds me a little bit, though, also of the guarantee that the Constitution gives to that every state shall be a republic. And I'm not sure what that actually means in practice, but I think it does mean something.
It does mean something, and they don't say it'll be a republic, but a Republican form of government, that they guarantee a Republican form of government. And I should know, I wish I had a better historical understanding of how the whole term Republican grew and had a more full understanding of it. But it does. That's been brought up numerous times. For instance, it was brought up in Colorado when they passed the Taxpayer Bill of Rights that required that any tax increase get a vote of the people, or that any spending increase beyond a certain amount, inflation plus population control, would have to get a vote of the people, and you couldn't spend that extra money without a vote of the people. And the lawsuit in federal court said that this means Colorado doesn't have a Republican form of government, meaning that somehow their representative system was not functioning in a free way. And of course, I look at that and I think, you've got some kind of crazy idea about what republicanism and freedom and it is all about, because we have a right to establish a government that we can then check up on. And the idea that the voters would decide something directly and that would somehow destroy the Republican form of government, I think is a kind of a mistaken view of what republicanism is all about, small r republicanism. But that it has never really gotten any traction in federal court, not in that case, thank goodness, or in others. So it does seem to be at this stage one of those kind of throwaway things that, we're guaranteeing you're going to have basically a free society. But it would be interesting if there was a case at some point that defined it in some real way for our kind of judicial system.
We have a Ninth Amendment that basically means nothing right now because it's not almost never used. I mean, there is one or two small little elements where it's mentioned in case law and constitutional law, but that's about it. Really, your Wednesday piece is a follow-up to this piece, and maybe we should go right into the Wednesday piece and skip over Tuesday and come back to it.
That sounds good, because it really is. And I alluded to it, when more is better. And we're saying more, there's a lot of more and less in this. We're saying more, meaning more representatives. And having more representatives leads to more representation, which is wonderful. It also leads to more representatives, which could be equivalent to politicians, which, of course, the first blush of most people is not so wonderful. There is, and a lot of polls show this around the country, different places. There's been talk of, reducing the size of the legislature. Years ago, the only initiative that has ever passed in Illinois' completely Byzantine initiative process is one to reduce the size of the legislature. I think it was a big mistake. Love Pat Quinn, who was actually the guy behind it, and one of my favorite Democrats, but that was a mistake. And it's around the country, you have different places where they've suggested having smaller legislatures, and the idea is we'll somehow save money. The critical dynamic in a representative democracy, we have a constitutional republic that functions as a representative democracy. We have representatives, no direct democracy whatsoever, unfortunately, at the federal level. We do have it elsewhere, but not at that level. So it's it's democratic means, completely representative. So if you don't have people actually representing you, if somehow the relationship between the person going to Congress or the state legislature to argue your interests and you is not connected, that's not a good relationship. All of a sudden, our whole system of government is in trouble. And let me suggest, our whole system of government is in trouble because that relationship is in deep, deep trouble. And I think the biggest reason it's in trouble is because we have congressional districts that on average are well over 700,000 people to a district. And what that means is to run for office in that district, you have to be able to reach out to 700,000 people. Well, that's expensive. And so it tends to make money more important. You can't go knock on all the doors, no matter how much energy you have. That's a lot of doors. And so you got to do TV ads and mail and everything else. And these huge districts amplify the importance and the power of special interests because they write big checks and because they are already organized. They can mobilize big people, big numbers, because you got to reach big numbers. If my experience, and one of the ways that I've just seen this up front and just feel it in my bones, the only place that we were able to get congressional term limits through a legislature was in New Hampshire, where their House is 400 members. New Hampshire's House is 400 people. It's almost as big as the U.S. House. But instead of 700,000 plus size districts, their average district's a little over 3,000 people. That means if 7 people call you over the course of a 24-hour period to talk about, House Bill 27, all of a sudden you care about House Bill 27 because everybody's talking about it. Because those 7 people represent a lot more, and that's out of 3,000 people. You can't afford to lose them. If you get 7 calls, or 27, or maybe 70 in California, where your House district is 500,000 people, your Senate district's 1 million people, that call just does not mean the same thing. That constituent does, in practical, political, electoral terms, and let me just depress you, that is the way folks in every state legislature and in Washington, D.C. think. And even the ones who can get beyond that thought going through their head all the time, everybody thinks that way. And so you have a different level of representation in New Hampshire than you do in California or in a lot of other states where you have districts that are 250,000 people or 100,000. And so one of the things that I think would make the biggest change in the way we are governed and would restore some semblance of representation, real representation, would be to have districts that are 100,000 or less. I'd like them to be about 50,000. But of course, you're talking 4,000 some odd members. You could have districts that were about a little under 200,000. I believe you're under 2,000 members of Congress. But of course, once you do that, then there are other things you are probably going to want to do. You're not going to want 2,000. You're not going to want to build a huge new capitol. You're not going to want to build all kinds of new infrastructure in Washington, D.C. You're going to want these people to vote from home. You're going to want them to meet in Washington for very short periods of time to get to know each other, to discuss, to take testimony. You're going to want to use technology. I mean, remember that it wasn't it was a couple decades ago that it took a major revolution in the country to get rid of, the folks in the Congress taking ice around to every office, as if we lived in a time in which there wasn't an ice maker anywhere. This is how, Washington doesn't innovate until 100 years beyond the rest of us, for the most part. So it would require that they start to do some things to use technology. But the best thing of all, maybe not the best thing of all would be the fact that your call is going to be more important. Your opinion is going to be more important than it used to be. The next best thing is that they are going to cast votes from their own districts, with you and I hanging around with them, instead of other politicians and lobbyists and the whole Washington press corps and the whole apparatus of apparatchiks hanging out. So it's night and day difference in that way. Anyway, I think this makes the most difference of any reform I can think of. And I would do almost anything to get term limits implemented. I love the initiative process. There's all kinds of reforms we need. I love them all. But at the core of our whole system is representation. And it's broken largely because these districts are so big that the average person need not apply. And we end up with representatives who are an elite and who basically, they fly into town every once in a while to be with us, but they're not one of us. And that's a death knell for representative democracy.
Which is one reason that breaking many of the states into pieces might help, is that they could increase the representation in the process.
Yes.
For if LA County were its own state, I mean, it's a huge town, and LA County could be, or that in Orange, or that in the one of the other neighboring counties could become a state.
I think it's 12 million people or something. It's 5 million. It's millions and millions of people. It'd be bigger than many, many states.
Right. So if you break it down by counties or in New York boroughs, if you get those things done as separate states, that the remaining representation in the state that's the bigger part of the state that has less people or has not as concentrated a population of people, their representation might go up. I mean, it would allow for that kind of thing, kind of naturally to flow. That's one of the reasons I actually like the idea of splitting up the states.
Yeah, I think that's a positive. I think it's very, very tough to do, and largely because of the Senate and all the political concern that two U.S. Senate seats are just so valuable. But I think you're right, and you don't have to split them up to have smaller districts, but size does matter, and I think you want to have things as small as is reasonable. I mean, you don't want to make 7 states out of LA County, but you might want to make 1 state out of it, or you might want to take the 3 or 4 counties around that and make a state. There's different ways to do it, but it would help to have smaller. I would put the emphasis on that concept of representation and the districts being really small. For instance, if you were to split California into a state for every few counties, but were to actually increase the size of the districts, and you could do that. I mean, right now I believe there are 5. And this is why I can't think of whether it's 5 million or 12 million. It's either 5 million in LA County and 12 supervisors, or 5 supervisors and 12 million, or something like that. But anyway, if you create a separate state there and you continue to have districts that are that huge, you're not going to get any better representation. And so that's the reason that I think the size of those districts comes even before the size of the geopolitical unit overall.
One of the great joys of doing these recordings remotely from one end of the country to another is that sometimes the system fails, the technology fails, and so we had to stop in the middle and come back an hour later and finish the job. So we go back to Tuesday, the rates that matter, and I asked Paul about it.
I think this was really a piece that, as we did it, it seemed like a lot of other folks were noticing the same thing. And I say that I'm, not so much in the media, although there too, but just in real life. My tennis buddy mentioned this to me, in between sets. We get to talking, and what the rates that matter were about is the fact that when it comes to COVID-19 and this pandemic, it seems like the goalposts keep changing, and that we're talking we're talking about flatten the curve, and the whole idea being to push some of these cases off into the future so that the hospitals aren't overrun. That's the reason that we shelter in place, is to just flatten that curve. We don't think we can shelter in place a few weeks and the virus is gone. If that were the case, this would be over. And we point out that Jeff Tucker had pointed that out in a tweet, that now everybody's surprised that a few months down the road there's another bunch of cases and the virus is there. That was the whole point, to flatten the curve. And I think the biggest thing, which Ron Paul, former Congressman Dr. Ron Paul, talked about the fact that all of a sudden, instead of talking about the death counts, the folks who are dying from COVID-19, and that number is decreasing and is not spiking, all of a sudden they're talking about the number of cases, which is spiking. And of course, the more testing you have, you're going to have more cases, and we're going to have more cases. I mean, no one knows exactly how this is going to turn out, but we should not be shocked that a virus continues to be a virus, and we should not think that, even though there's certain reasons, I think, to have some hope that we might get a vaccine. There's no reason to think that that's just going to happen in a few months. It's just a matter of course. It's not a matter of course. And we have to come to grips with, do we just shut down society every time we think there may be more cases of this? Because we're going to take what I think is a disaster in shutting down the way we did without, and we'll get to why the problem with shutting down the way we did, the key problem as I see it. But we can't just continue to do that forever. It's already been damaging. But if you do, the longer you do that, the more damage. At a certain point, you don't have any stuff anymore because everything is deteriorated, and you've been hiding in your home for the last 20 years. And it will happen before 20 years. The problem with the way that we shut down and the way that we're reopening is that we forgot the lesson of freedom. We forgot the fact that the strength of our society isn't the ability of one person in Washington or one person in your state capital listening to all the experts and making the decision for everybody and flipping the switch. The brilliance of the wisdom of crowds of America is, why not allow people to be free? Give us the information, but let the businessman who's ready to reopen and who believes, after talking probably to his lawyer and his accountant and his and his insurance agent especially, that the way they're opening is safe and so on. Let that person open because you want things to be open. And let the person who says, I don't think we're ready yet, not open. And this whole time, we should be focused on people who are vulnerable doing the smart things. They have to do it on their own. They can choose to not be smart. And of course, other folks who are not as vulnerable can be more aggressive and still not be dumb about it. But freedom allows people to make billions and trillions and gazillions of small decisions about their own lives with the most knowledge and with a real desire not to die. And so I think we can trust people. Will everyone be perfect? No. But you know what? If you, as we've said several times on this podcast, if you just spew orders from on high, you know what? Everybody doesn't follow them then either. So anyway, I think that's been just a huge problem. And of course, what this piece gets at primarily, and most importantly, is that the media likes fear and destruction and for some legitimate reasons, in the sense that they know people want to tune in more when there's a hurricane or there's a natural disaster or there's a big story and there's emotions, and if there's violence, if there's fires, if there, all of these things have an impact. But I think the other thing that has an impact with our media at this moment in time is that they want this to be a disaster for the president of the United States. And I think most people who criticize Trump would, surely they think he can screw things up all on his own. He doesn't need any help. But this is I think such the most politicized disaster that I've witnessed in my lifetime. And I think that there is a desire to push the story in ways that are political. And that's just never a good thing. And the reason, not that the politics doesn't seep into things and people's opinions isn't naturally going to seep into things to a certain extent, but this extent is way beyond accidental. And it's continual. This isn't the only case of it. We have narrative-driven media. Their narratives have political ideologies behind them. There's nothing per se evil or wrong about that unless you hide it, unless you're trying to trick people. And the problem is they're trying to trick people because they do hide it. They do pretend that they're totally objective and that they don't have these narratives. And the other huge, giant problem is I happen to believe that the American people should make the decision. And so it's important that the American people have information flowing all over the place, easy to get and easy to refute. And so I want this wide open information system, and they want a narrative-driven information system that they have as much power in as possible. And the more that we get the narrative, the less we get the facts. And it makes it tougher and tougher for the American people, if we were ever in a position to make the decision, to have the information we need. Which, of course, then feeds the whole idea that, hey, we can't have all the information. The experts have to decide for us. The experts and the politicians and the attorneys writing the laws they all have to decide for us. And then, just to segue to our final script of the week, not in chronological order, but in this podcast order, you go very far along the line of, hey, the experts are all sorted out. People don't know what they're doing. They're not smart enough to know. They're not wise enough to decide. And where do you end up? You end up in China. And unfortunately, as we pointed out in the script, and what did we call? Oh, Last Bit of Freedom. We'll talk about the title in a minute, but about Hong Kong and the fact that the national security law that was passed in secret in Beijing by the Chinese legislature for this supposedly autonomous city-state of Hong Kong, 7.5 million people, with its own legislature, which of course is not really democratically one man, one vote decided, and in which the leader, the CEO, the chief executive of Hong Kong, is handpicked by Beijing. So it's already a problem, but now they've moved in and basically, if you say anything about independence, if you say anything that puts down the Chinese anthem or the Chinese whatever idea they have next, you can be arrested. People have already been arrested. As I pointed out, the first person arrested was arrested wearing this shirt here. He had a flag that said Hong Kong Independence, and it had in small letters right before Hong Kong Independence, it said "No to." Now the letters were small enough that no one could see on the street that it said "No to Hong Kong Independence." But of course, in court, it's only true that he had a sign that said "No to Hong Kong Independence." Can you be arrested for having letters that aren't the right size and put in prison for life? And that's basically what's happening. But of course, you can be. You can be. If you live in China, and as a woman pointed out who said, I'm going to be on the street protesting anyway, because I'm a human being who has rights, moving the way that she said it. If you go to thisiscommonsense.org and you go to the script, Last Bit of Freedom, there's a link. You can go hear her say it. But she just says that, now China is Hong Kong and Hong Kong is China. And it's sad. It's a very sad day. But she says, I am going to be out here on the street protesting because I'm a human being and I have rights, whether the police say so or anybody else says so. But what's happening has to be seen by the rest of the world, because for so long it seems like we have ignored China. We have hoped that the fact that it's growing wealthier and allows certain capitalism, certain markets driven policies, that it will allow some level of freedom. It doesn't. And in effect, what has happened is, as was pointed out in the Washington Post in their lead to the story, they mentioned that basically now the people of Hong Kong can be arrested and put in prison for life for anything they say derogatory about the Chinese Communist Party, just like the 1.4 billion people living in China. And I just think we have to not forget that no matter what happens in Hong Kong, China has 1.4 billion people who are living in the equivalent of any dictatorship anytime throughout history. If you said something against the king, your head is chopped off. That's China today with one huge difference. China has a national security state that is just beyond anything George Orwell ever dreamed of. Cameras everywhere. Everyone has their cell phone. The state knows what you purchased today. It knows where you've been, who you've talked to. When I think of just how despicable my own government's use of the NSA and of purposely, I think, absolutely purposely misinterpreting part of the FISA law, same law, the Patriot Act, to allow them to scoop up all of our business records, banking, social media, phone records, so on and so on. That's horrible. Well, that's China, just 100-fold with nothing to hold them back and no ability for free speech. Free speech has been snuffed out. Now, people in Hong Kong are brave enough to face getting the hell beat out of them and being dragged off to a jail where they're likely to get the hell beat out of them again with no investigation of that, even though that's been one of the main demands, that early on this completely peaceful march against extradition to China to be tried in courts that are crooked on trumped up charges, millions go into the streets and police begin to be violent before any protesters were defacing anything or doing anything of that sort. And they asked for an investigation. And of course, there's been none. So what's happening in Hong Kong, I don't have any magic wand to change it. But one of the things that struck me was Joshua Wong, who, a young activist, I think he was like 17 in 2014, which makes him whatever now, but young, was involved in the Umbrella Revolution. And he was out on the street and was protesting and so on. And he was not allowed to run for office because, of course, he's well known enough that he'll get elected. He's been in a long battle. He's been arrested several times. But he asked the international community to don't forget Hong Kong and put pressure on China. And it occurred to me, and he mentioned, because we need you to help defend our last bit of freedom, which is what we entitled this piece on Friday. And I think as we are in Independence Weekend, Independence Day, celebrating freedom in America, let's remember that when he asked the international community to help, to stand with Hong Kong, I'm not sure exactly what you can do, what I can do, but let's consider ourselves as individuals. This isn't something our government's doing while we're not paying attention. As individuals who are paying attention, the whole world is watching. Let's look for what we can do, and that's it. We have to be engaged. The other thing about this script is I thought afterwards, Tim, that maybe we should have called it Too Free, because I thought the most interesting thing was in the Washington Post article about this. There's one of the pro-Beijing city council people in Hong Kong. And of course, they didn't pass this law. That was done secretly in China and imposed on them. But he came out and said that basically this is a good thing, this national security law, because the problem is Hong Kong has been too free. And we have lived in a world our whole lives, centuries before that. And now, as we march into the future, we live in a world where I think we are not free enough as individuals. And we have plenty to fear from governments who are powerful and driven by interests that are not friendly. And then you have part of the world, China, where, and it's not alone, unfortunately, but where democracy is verboten, where the problem is too much freedom, where the answer is that the state, the experts, the party, Big Brother, Xi Jinping should make the decision for all of us. They know best. And that philosophy is enslaving more than 1 billion people in China, threatening all of their neighbors, including India now through the mountains, Himalayas. But that philosophy is unfortunately alive and well in our own country. And we don't need to run around calling people communists or names of any kind. We need to point out that philosophy and give the rebuttal, and freedom will win. All over the world, give people a choice between freedom and big government taking care of them. And people are smart enough to choose freedom. We've made mistakes, but as long as we keep making those choices, they make that choice in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong's free. They make that choice. The truth is, I think you could let any place in China vote in a free election, and they'd vote out the Chinese Communist Party in a heartbeat. So democracy is not perfect, but we have a really such a stark difference, I think, in that we have the second most, maybe arguably the most powerful country in the world that hates democracy and hates free speech. And the United States of America is the beacon to the world, to people I've met all over the world who make me kind of feel like, geez, I can think of all the bad things we've done, and they're thinking of this is where the concept of freedom came from a lot of times. This is where the concept of equality came from. This is where dignity for people came from. And we ought not to be arrogant that somehow we did all of that, but we ought to take a moment this weekend and appreciate that some people, lots of people, sacrificed lots in wars, not in wars, in agitating and being ridiculed or belittled or arrested. But lots of people have created this idea that the individual should be free, that the individual and all of us collectively ought to be in charge and not some master over us. And we got lots of disagreements, but boy, let's all celebrate that and have some fun too.
Thank you for tuning in to This Week in Common Sense, starring Paul Jacob. My name is Timothy Virkala. You can find me at locofoco.net, at workman.com, and at Workman on social media. That's Workman with an I, not an O. This Week in Common Sense is the weekend podcast of Paul Jacob, and you can find it on YouTube, as well as in audio form on SoundCloud and via podcatchers such as Apple, Google, and Stitcher. Thank you.
Oh, and I mentioned this was Friday's script. I'm discombobulated. This was Thursday's script, and let people get a look here. I got this from this shirt, Free Hong Kong, which I don't read Mandarin Chinese, not yet, but I understand that's what it says below it too. But I got this from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, I think is the full name. But they've done a lot about what has been happening in China and what happened in Russia, and about all the bodies on that sort of thing, and that have been piled up. And it can happen again. It happens again every day somewhere in the world. And we should be darn glad that it doesn't happen more. And we should be working to protect. Anytime I think about our history, at least from the ideals, which are so beautiful, and I think about how terrible the world is, it does, and how we have it better than so many people. It does make me feel really good to be an American, but it also makes me feel a duty, not to anybody else other than my own heart, but it makes me feel a duty to me to do what I can to keep it and expand it. And I think any of the people throughout history who have struggled and done so much for freedom, they're not looking for us to pat them on the back. They're dead. They wanted freedom. They wanted it expanded. And for us to sit around arrogantly like, hey, we have it all. We don't. It's a constant struggle, and we should be part of that struggle.